Welcome to the Doctor's Eyes Only podcast, brought to you by Vestia Personal Wealth Advisors, where we are on a mission to help the highest caliber physicians achieve wealth that matters. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Doctor's Eyes Only podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Oschman, and today we are going to talk about succession planning for medical real estate with Collin Hart, who is from ERE Consultants. Collin is the CEO and managing director of ERE Healthcare Real Estate Advisors, where he leads the firm's strategy to provide executive-level advisory services to owners of healthcare real estate. Under his leadership, ERE Advisors has become a trusted partner in navigating complex real estate sale and restructuring transactions, maximizing value for physician partnerships and healthcare systems nationwide. Before co-founding ERE, Collin was a director in the real estate division of Brown, Gibbons, Lang & Company, a private investment banking firm. There, he specialized in advising physician partnerships and hospital systems on the monetization of highly specialized assets through expertly structured sale and leaseback transactions. Wow, that sounds very impressive.
Lauren, thanks.
Collin began his career in institutional investments, working for companies including Broadstone Net Lease and Noble Properties, a closely held family office. At Broadstone, he played an integral role in driving $300 million in single-tenant property acquisitions, propelling the REIT's portfolio beyond the $1 billion mark. Collaborating with C-suite executives, Collin structured an alternative capital solutions to support partnership liquidity and M&A activity. At Noble Properties, he gained hands-on experience in investment operations, overseeing property management, leasing, acquisitions, and dispositions for a 3 million square foot portfolio of retail real estate. Collin's extensive buy and sell side experience gives him a unique ability to source, structure, and negotiate advantageous transactions for clients and investors. That's, incredibly impressive background. I was not joking when I said that sounded impressive. And I know, because I have had the opportunity to speak with you before, that our listeners are going to get so much out of this conversation today. So welcome, Collin. I'm so glad you're here.
Lauren, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. And that sounds like so much experience, but I will tell you today, we're going to really break it down for your listeners so that real estate is a simple topic, not jargony, and we'll make it, straightforward to understand.
I love it. That is perfect. So let's, along those lines, what, in kind of plain English, what does ERE do?
Sure. So we specialize in working with physicians across the country to strategize on their real estate. Most of our clients are physicians. Most of them bought or built their building to control the destiny of their practice, but they haven't necessarily thought about the exit strategy for that investment. After all, you work in investment advisory. Yeah. Real estate is a form of investment. And so a lot of folks just say, hey, I'm going to buy my building because I want to own my home where they work. But they don't necessarily think about how to eventually get their money out. And so we ultimately make money by selling buildings, but the likelihood of somebody wanting to sell their practice or surgery center building tomorrow is very low. So what we do is help folks get set up properly in advance so that eventually they can sell their building, whether that's tomorrow or 20 years from now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I actually can't help but thinking of a derm path that I met years and years and years ago. And most of his portfolio, honestly, he worked in a private practice that had a number of different locations. And most of his portfolio was the buildings that the practice operated in these different locations. And so I was asking him some questions about, how much did he put into these different buildings? And then I asked the question, I said, well, what does it look like to sell your shares? And he said, what are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, well, how are you going to get your money back? Like when you retire someday, how are we going to decide what the value is that you get bought? Is there going to be a new partner that's going to buy you out of these? Like, what is the plan? And it was something that you could tell, despite being probably 10 years from retirement, he had never thought about. He had just bought into these because he was like, real estate's a good investment. The idea of kind of owning the home, like owning the place, having control of where you're running your business was very appealing. All of his partners did it.
Right.
And he didn't really have an awareness of how that connected to his ultimate financial independence. And so I love what you're saying about it's not just like you buy it and then you cross your fingers that you'll get your money back out of it one day, but you actually plan strategically for that. So I guess retirement obviously comes to mind, and that would, kind of have been this derm pass situation. The other scenario that we're seeing so much of right now, and this was how you and I connected, is doctors who are in private practice right now, who are selling their private practices to hospitals, to private equity firms that don't want to own the real estate. And so they find themselves needing to figure out how they're going to monetize the real estate maybe sooner than expected.
Sure.
So are those the kind of scenarios that you all work in? And what's an example of what something like that would look like?
Yeah, all of the above. So thanks for that primer. Let's start with the most simple one, which is there's no private equity involved. You're a physician. You own your real estate, or at least a piece of your real estate. Typically, our physician clients are set up where they own their practice in, a PC or LLC. They own their real estate in a separate entity, and they're simply paying rent from their practice to their real estate, right? So let's say there's a multi-member LLC, meaning multiple physicians own the building. There's typically some sort of buy-in or buy-out provision in terms of how the doctors get their money out. And a lot of times that centers around retirement, where there's some provision that says, if you retire, you can no longer be a shareholder in the real estate entity. So there's almost a forced buyout. Now that brings the question, exactly what you said, is how do we determine the value? And unfortunately, there's no preferred method. A lot of people do it by appraisal. A lot get bought in or bought out based on, what the historical value was. There's a lot of just different ways to do it, unfortunately. And so usually when we get to a situation like that, there's some disagreement on the value. Whoever's selling wants to get the most money. Whoever has to buy wants to pay the least money, right? So that creates some unnecessary tension in a partnership, number one. But then number two, there are other partnerships where they do not necessarily have to be bought out of the real estate. So now we have physicians who retire, who continue owning shares in the real estate, but they don't really control the practice. And so it really changes the dynamic of the investment, right? You went from owning your home to owning a home that you rent out. Like, let's just characterize it like that.
Yeah.
And so you don't make the decisions on the business, on the practice. And let's say at some point the practice decides to relocate, or the practice wants to pay lower rent. It just creates tension and misalignment, right? So those are things that people should think about in advance when they're getting into a partnership, frankly, not when they're setting out to retire. So that's, the first scenario.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think as I'm thinking about kind of what would be my takeaway if I'm a doctor who's listening, if I'm a younger doctor that's maybe has an opportunity for partnership coming up, I would maybe want to see those operating agreements before I make the decision on whether or not I'm going to buy into the real estate, just to understand what those provisions look like and who are the other owners. Are they the existing partners of the practice? Are they people that haven't been a part of the practice for years? Just to kind of know who you're getting into business with. I think that's a great point. I mean, this concept of value, I think, is a very interesting one because, like you said, I mean, there's value is ultimately what someone's willing to pay. And so I guess, are there any things that you typically run into where it's like, this is just a fundamental misunderstanding about how to think about it?
Let me tell you. Yeah. I mean, there are so many, but I'll distill it. So the biggest misnomer I think we run into is valuing just according to an appraisal. And so, it's funny when you buy your home, let's just say not your work home, but your actual home, and you go to apply for a mortgage, it turns out that most of the time they're going to want an appraisal. And when you buy that home, it's pretty amazing that you get the appraisal back and it's for the exact value that you're buying the home for, right? It's funny how that works out. You just have to remember that whoever is generating the appraisal, they're coming from an unbiased position, but they're just kind of following directions. And so depending on the directions that you provide, their appraised value will come in high or low, right? It totally depends on the objective. So people say, hey, I have an appraisal for X dollars. And I say, that's great, but let's look at the assumptions that they're making. And do we agree with those assumptions in this circumstance? And appraising medical properties is one thing. And there are some specialists who do that, although most doctors do not identify like a medical appraisal specialist. But now let's talk about appraising, a 20% interest in a building, because let's say you have 4 other partners, there's 5 of you in the partnership. Well, what's the value of a 20% interest in real estate? So number one, real estate's illiquid anyways. Number two, a 20% limited partnership interest is really illiquid. So you can't really value that limited partnership interest just as if you were selling or buying a whole building, right?
Because you can't even make decisions. As a 20% owner, you don't even have a controlling position, and that can be part of how something's valued as well.
Exactly. So I always say, hey, it's great that you have an appraisal, but appraisals are not really what determine value. The market is what determines value. And so appraisers typically look at historical values, like you have your home appraised, they're going to look at other homes that sold in your neighborhood when when we're valuing a building, we say, hey, here's what the market will buy your building for, right? Or here's how the market will value your building. So I think that's the biggest misnomer in terms of value determination in those partnerships.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's really helpful to understand, to even just give some forethought to how is that going to be determined, make sure that's defined in your operating agreements, and then knowing what those operating agreements say so that when you're ultimately thinking about your own financial independence, retirement, things like that, you kind of know what that's going to be based on.
Agreed. And then let's just talk about the sole proprietor situation, or let's say a sole owner. Maybe there's multiple doctors, but not everybody's a partner. So in a circumstance where you're on your own and you retire, but you still own your building, well, let's just say that there's no other providers there. So you bought your building to basically run your practice in. But if you are not practicing there anymore, the building is valued differently, right? And so typically we want to get involved with our clients early, maybe when they have at least 10 years left to practice, because when we're valuing and selling buildings, we're not just valuing the building, we're valuing and helping them sell kind of a cash flowing investment, which is selling that building with a lease attached to it. And so if you're retiring, well, you're not going to sign a lease with somebody else, right? And so that changes the sale proposition and ultimately the value of the building, usually negatively, right? Like the value is going to be lower.
Yeah, that's a great point too, just to think about like selling a building with a current tenant who has a really strong lease that's indexed to inflation appropriately and all of these things is a much more attractive buy for someone else.
And so let's talk about that. I mean, even before we get into the private equity stuff, which I love, right? I mean, and it's such a hot topic. A typical sale transaction for us, or a succession planning strategy that a lot of our clients use, is they say, hey, I own my real estate in one entity. I own my practice in another entity. I'm already paying rent, right? And so we explain to them that a building with a lease attached to it, or really a building with a stream of rental cash flow attached to it, is valued differently and more at a more premium value than just a building. And so if you're going to continue practicing for the next 10 years, maybe even next 5 years, but prefer to have 10, then we can help you monetize your building where you're continuing to pay rent, but now instead of paying rent from one pocket to another, you're paying rent to a new third-party landlord. And so what that does is it doesn't change your financial overhead or obligation, but now because you're essentially selling a stream of rental income that's attached to the building, we can sell it for usually a multiple of that rent. So instead of being valued, just as a building, it's really valued as a multiple of a stream of rental income.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a safety in that is what I'm thinking about, because I think about, having an investment that is paying. If I just think about like, I want to buy an investment and I have the option to kind of roll the dice on something that could go up in value, could go down, versus thinking about it as I'm buying something that's going to give me stability and it's going to pay me some interest as I go. That's much more like what you're talking about. And again, there's a more attractive value proposition there to a real estate investor.
Right. And so that takes some forethought. I can't tell you how many times we've spoken to folks, 5 or 10 years ago, and they said, no, we're going to be here forever. We're going to own our building. It's a great investment for us. Now we fast forward and they're calling us and they want to sell their building, but they're on the verge of retirement and the practice isn't going to be there anymore. And so those unfortunately are bad stories, right? Where people lose money. It's not about making money. It's just they lose money.
Yeah.
So those are things to kind of be mindful of in the world of independent practice.
Yeah. Well, and I think beginning with the end in mind, or kind of approaching today with the end in mind and then working your way backwards, I think is such good advice. So I love that you're framing it that way. Okay. So now let's talk about the other scenario. And this was, I read this just maybe 2 weeks ago, that pre-pandemic, it was like 50% of doctors were employed somewhere by a hospital system or some other entity. And now that number is north of 80%. Just a few years later. And largely that is because private practices, after having gone through the pandemic, are looking to offload some of the operational kind of business, running of the business responsibility. They're potentially looking to monetize their practices now, understanding that the future is not certain. And so private equity platforms have become big buyers of medical practices. And once private equity purchases a medical practice, those doctors are then employed by the purchaser. And so I think that's what has driven a lot of that. Because that's a staggering 30% change in just a few years. So what happens when doctors own real estate? And then we have kind of a change in the structure of or ownership of the practice.
This is my favorite topic. I'm so glad you're bringing this up. So You own your practice, you own your real estate, you pay rent to yourself. You control everything, right? You hold all the cards. If at some point you wanted to increase your rent, then you can. If you want to decrease your rent, then you can, right? You own everything. When you're selling your practice, and by the way, increasing or decreasing your rent, because previously we talked about a building being valued according to a multiple of rent. So if you increase your rent, that increases the value of your building. All other things being equal. So now let's talk about you're selling your practice. You're going to sell your practice to private equity or the hospital. And now they are going to be the tenant. They are going to be the practice. And you no longer have operational or at least business decision-making control. You're going to still work there. You're making the clinical decisions, but from a business standpoint, you're not calling the shots, right? So that involves, how much rent is paid. That involves staffing, billing, everything, right? And so what we're here to talk about today is the real estate. But if you owned and controlled everything, and now you pass off or transfer control of the tenant or the business to someone else, now we have not an affiliated transaction, but we are now effectively leasing to a third party, right? You are going to be the doctor that works in the practice, and you are going to be the landlord that rents to the practice, but you don't make decisions for the practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you could move your rent up or down before, if you could modify the terms of the lease before, you can't anymore, right? So what ends up happening is whatever lease is in place in advance of your private equity or hospital transaction, typically that lease is either adopted by the buyer of the practice, or they want to negotiate a new one. For better or worse, because most of our clients lease from themselves starting out, they just have a very basic form of lease. There may have been an attorney involved, but it might have been 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. And nobody was really paying attention to it because they said, well, whatever, we're leasing from ourselves. So they're not looking necessarily at the rent. Maybe they are, they want to make sure that they're in the range of fair market value, but they're not looking at the other terms that might modify the value of the building, right? So it becomes really important when you're going to or preparing for a sale of your practice that you make sure the terms that are in place in your lease are terms that are market, but also allow you to maximize the value of the building at any time in the future. Because once that lease is assigned to the new owner of your practice, you can't change it, or it's very difficult to change, right? Because now we're not negotiating with ourselves. We're negotiating with the hospital or the private equity guys.
Yeah. And I think that's an excellent point that a lot of people wouldn't think about, because you're exactly right. I mean, how many leases were done kind of almost back of the napkin, maybe by an attorney who was a friend of one of the partners of the practice or something like that. And it's very bare bones to check the box and, establish that it's fair market value rent or whatever, but not really thinking about protection, not really thinking about what happens if things go wrong, not really thinking about having to deal with a third party. And so that would be the last thing on my mind, I think, if I were a physician facing this huge financial, life-changing, potentially financial and business transition, would be thinking about like, oh my gosh, I should probably get my lease in order.
I agree with you. It's the last thing on anybody's mind. So a lot of our physician clients are selling to private equity or to the hospital, right? And so they might have a 5, 10, 20, 50, $100 million transaction ahead of them, right? Seriously. So not only that, but they're totally moving from an entrepreneurial role to an employed role. So it's a huge decision. There's so many considerations. Hey, what's my legacy going to be? What does my compensation look like? What happens to my staff? Nobody's thinking about the real estate. I have a building. It's great. I collect rent.
Well, and that's probably as easy as in the conversation. It's like, oh yeah, we'll assume the lease and we'll just pay that rent too. Okay, great. Check done. Moving on.
Correct. And so it's easy for that to get pushed for the real estate to get pushed to the back burner. So our goal is not necessarily to be involved in any private equity transactions. That's not what we do. But what we want to do is make sure that our physician clients preserve their optionality related to their real estate and make sure they preserve the value, because there's too many times where those back of the napkin leases get assigned to private equity or get assigned to the hospital. Now it's a lease in place with a third party. They have no incentive to change it, and the building can't be sold, or if it needs to be sold, the value's low.
So thinking about the idea of like changing from being a business owner, entrepreneur, and running the practice, making the decisions, to giving that up, And I'm thinking about how the private equity transactions tend to be structured. So I'm thinking now your income is controlled by this new owner of your practice. You probably have stock in that platform because a lot of times some of that payout is like retained stock. And so if the platform continues to do well, then you could potentially make more money. If they sell in the future, you could make more money. And then they also control, because this real estate should be a diversifier. It should be a different type of income for you, something that's a little bit more stable, a little bit more dependable, and yet it's controlled by the same entity.
Same party. Yeah.
Yeah. And so is there a way that you can use the decisions you make with your real estate to impact that at all for your benefit?
Absolutely. So you jumped ahead a little bit in a good way because what you focused on is so important. But let's think about it like this. So you relinquish control of the practice. And so now you move to an employed model, right? Mm-hmm. And so you said it exactly right. You're now collecting your professional income from your employer. You have rollover equity or stock with your private equity platform, and now they pay rent to you. So to your point, you want to diversify with real estate, but you're really not diversified because the rent's coming from your employer and who you hold a lot of stock in. So you're really like tripled down, right? Professional income, rollover equity, real estate rent. And so that's a major concentration of your assets being held with one party, right? In those circumstances, I tend to be a fan of saying, hey, you should probably diversify a little bit. You're not betting on the private equity, but they have a business plan that they're trying to see through as well. And so if you can diversify away from that, let's do it. Well, you can't go work somewhere else because you have an employment contract. So the professional income, it's stuck. The rollover equity, it's stuck. So the real estate is the only one of those assets that's kind of liquid, which historically real estate is not even a liquid asset, but it is more liquid than the other two, right? And so in circumstances like that, I would say it may make sense to sell your real estate, not because you have to, but because you want to diversify a little bit. And because if you were going through your practice transaction with kind of the insight to do something down the road, your real estate might be optimized to sell, which we could talk about whenever you think that's appropriate.
Yeah. I think that would be great to talk about, because I was kind of thinking about that. Like, what are some of the considerations if I'm thinking, hey, I don't know, because some of these things, you don't know what you don't know right now. So you're thinking at some point, like, I do have ownership in this building, or we have ownership in this building. At some point, I need to sell it. And for some practices too, that's just the younger partners either don't have interest or financially aren't able to. The market is very different now. And so it might not be financially viable for them to become partners in the real estate entity and also the practice. So what do I need to be thinking about?
The traditional mode of getting your money out of your real estate is selling it to your associates on the path to partnership. But to your point, a lot of those folks don't have the money to do it. They don't want to be tied down with the debt. They can't qualify for the debt. Maybe they just got out of school. They want to buy a new home. Who knows, right? There's so many reasons. So you cannot rely on that. Now, there are certain circumstances where I say, hey, it really makes sense. You want to take care of your younger folks and sell to them, but you're probably not going to sell for a premium value. And as long as you're okay with that, but if you're okay with that, that's okay, right? But don't think about this as an investment if you're okay giving it away. Right? Now, let's dive into the lease terms. And I'm going to give like a high level. We won't get into too many nuances. And everybody says, look, I have a great real estate attorney. Famous last words. I love attorneys, when we need them. And I'm friends with a lot of attorneys, but you really do need somebody who specializes in real estate, specifically selling real estate, to kind of look into this stuff, because attorneys do not sell real estate. So let's talk about the terms. Number one, you want your lease to be long-term in nature. Long-term is a relative thing. Some people think 5 years is long-term. In our case, we would typically recommend a minimum 10-year lease. You'd rather have 15 years. So when you're going through a transaction, you want to put a 10 to 15-year lease in place. Next, you want to have a rent that's set at fair market value. Now, everybody says, well, my rent's fair market value. It's way more art than science. There's no perfect answer. And if you ask me, it depends on the day, but more importantly, it depends on your objectives. So if you have a specific goal for the value of your real estate, and we can reasonably justify that your rent is in fair market value, then great. If you come to me with an egregious rent number that just is way out of bounds, then I'll tell you. But generally speaking, if you own, let's say, a surgery center building, your rent could be anywhere between $20 and $60 a square foot. If you have a clinical building, your rent could be anywhere from $15 to $30 per square foot. I mean, there's a really wide range. And let's admit, medical buildings are really specialized. So no building is exactly the same. It's not like your house next door. It's not a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, right?
Right. Well, and I guess I'm thinking about like, why is that term fair market value so important? If I don't do real estate, then I might, why do they keep using this term fair market value?
It's like an attorney and regulatory thing. That's been my experience. Nobody wants to get in trouble, in particular with Stark Law. And so I think the hospitals have kind of pushed that. And when we start talking about like healthcare regulatory frameworks, rent needs to be in fair market value, but it's really squishy. Let's just say that.
Especially, if you're renting to yourself, you have to rent within the range of what you could rent to someone else.
Yeah.
It's essentially when you're talking about $20 to $60 a square foot, like that is the
major difference.
Principle,
yeah.
But you have to decide where you're going to fall in that range.
Exactly right. So that's, kind of the second important component of having a good lease. Third, we want to make sure that there's annual rental increases. So, people say, hey, it's kind of a hedge against inflation. Real estate investors like to see that there's rent growth. And when you have a long-term lease, you need that scheduled rental increase in order to show rent growth. This is not an apartment building where, leases expire every year and you can raise the rents. This is a long-term lease, right? And so having the long-term lease provides longevity and predictability for the practice, but along with that needs to come those rental increases. No physician that I've met with recently has told me their reimbursements are going up. So sometimes it hurts when we say, hey, rent increases should be 2 to 3% per year. But that's the market.
Well, yeah. And then you see reimbursements have gone down by an average of 3 to 4% per year. That's a whole other episode right there.
Agreed. Yeah. Particularly if you're preparing for a PE transaction, annual rental increases.
Yeah. Well, and that's the key. You're thinking about it preparing for a sale. So you're not thinking about, hey, I'm charging this to myself. You're thinking, hey, this is what the tenant needs to pay in order for this to be valuable for me to sell.
Yeah, exactly right. So then let's talk about kind of a nuanced lease term, which is referred to as triple net. So when I talk to our physician clients, they've all heard of triple net. Everybody nods their head, which is great. And so we're just going to define it. And basically what triple net means is that in addition to the rent, which we'll call base rent, a practice or tenant is also responsible for operating expenses of the building. So operating expenses are property taxes, property insurance, building maintenance, repairs, replacements, that sort of thing. And so the reason that that's important is because if you ever go to sell your building, whoever's buying your building wants to know that they have a sure and predictable stream of income. So by the practice or tenant being responsible for all the operating costs of the building, it enables a landlord to say, hey, I know I'm getting X dollars in rent per year. And so that stream of rental income is easier to value. Right. And so because it's a predictable stream of rental income with nothing that can kind of chip into it, like roof repairs or replacing toilets or whatever it might be, they can say, hey, the rent is $250,000 a year. I'm going to value the building as though I'm getting $250,000 a year. Right. And so they're willing to pay a higher premium or a higher multiple because that stream of income is so sure. So there are a lot of shades or flavors of triple net. And so there's so many clients who say, oh yeah, my lease is triple net, but we as the landlord pay for property taxes, or we as the landlord are responsible for this or that. And so that's a really nuanced piece of your lease that can be, an entire page kind of defining, hey, what are the responsibilities and who pays for what? So that's a critical one. And then I think the last two, in particular, if you're going through a private equity transaction, you want to make sure that under the terms of your lease, you're allowed as the landlord to request the financial statements of your tenant or your practice. And so that might seem silly to a physician who owns the practice and owns the real estate. Well, I work here. I know how much money we make. But if you're a landlord, you want to have visibility into that. And as your relationship with your private equity or hospital partner continues to grow, or, eventually you go through your employment contract and you don't work there anymore, but you still own the building, well, you need to be able to monitor the financial performance of your tenant because you are dependent on your tenant for rent. And the way I like to characterize that is if you owned a rental condo and you went to rent it to somebody, you're going to ask for their bank statements. It's the exact same thing, right?
Or like verify their employment, make sure that they make the amount of money they're telling you they make.
You know, a lease can be 30 to 60 pages. So there's so much that we could talk about, but those are the key points that I think need to be addressed as you're kind of preparing for a private equity deal.
Yeah. No, that's such a great point. So then I find myself wondering as you're talking, and so I'm sure listeners are wondering the same thing. If I'm saying, hey, I'm really in on what you're saying, like there are already all of these ways that this purchaser controls my destiny in essence. And I really like the idea of taking them out of the real estate equation. And I want to sell my building. Who are we talking about selling it to?
Great question. So the buyers of medical real estate tend to be institutional investors. So you could almost think of them like private equity investors, but instead of buying practices, they buy buildings. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so a common terminology might be a REIT or a real estate investment trust. You may work with some of those.
I think a lot of listeners will recognize that as something they see maybe in their portfolio. They might have like REITs as a category of investment and they kind of know that as like, oh, that's your real estate mutual fund.
Sure. That's kind of like what it is. Exactly. So there's investment vehicles like that whose job is to acquire buildings leased to top performing practices who pay rent, right? And so REIT is like a common term or buyer profile. There's also real estate private equity funds, family offices, or even just high net worth individuals. And so they all have different kind of fancy names, but they buy buildings that are leased to top performing tenants. And so that's what the market looks like. And what's interesting is how I got into this is I actually used to work on the REIT side. So I used to work for a REIT and we were buying buildings and we bought a lot of buildings from physicians. And so one of the common objections or concerns that we hear is, well, I don't want to lose control of my building. I don't want to sell my building because we're going to lose control. And so you have to understand that if you have the right lease in place, you should never lose control of your building because the lease dictates the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. So no matter who owns that building, whether it's you or anybody else, they have to abide by the terms of the lease.
And you ideally structure that lease before you sold the building.
Bingo. Absolutely. It must be. Yeah. Before you sold the building, before you sold your practice, everything, right? So we're kind of going into this thinking about the future. So if the lease is structured correctly, you don't lose control. But not only that, the folks who buy buildings, they're not in the business of finding new tenants for buildings. They're in the business of collecting rent. And so really the last thing that these landlords that buy specialized medical buildings want to do is go find another, leading orthopedic group to lease this 30,000 square foot building. So there's some inherent protection from that standpoint that you have a really specialized building and that the folks who may ultimately buy your building just want to collect rent from you. It's intended to almost be a partnership, even though the relationship is really just as a landlord and tenant.
Well, and I know I've talked to physicians before. If it really is kind of this diversification play, then you could sell your real estate to a fund, and then you could actually turn around and invest in a fund that owns diversified medical real estate. So in different geographic areas, different types of medical specialties, things like that. And so you can still have that exposure in your portfolio, but kind of diversify out of being so entwined with one party, be that the hospital purchaser, the private equity platform, or what have you.
Absolutely agree. And I think you can do that. I'm sure you can perform, have your investments allocated with your clients in that way. And then alternatively, if people say, hey, I'm really concerned about the taxes, there are other tax deferred ways to say, hey, we're going to sell the building, but then we're going to diversify or do some sort of tax deferred exchange, commonly known as a 1031 exchange, into other assets or into a.
Right. Because if you go like to like, so if it's real estate to real estate, then you can kind of roll the tax obligation forward. So that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up.
And that's one method. And then a lot of people just say, hey, I'm okay paying the taxes and I want to invest with Lauren because she can put me in a diversified pool of, other real estate investors, right? So I think it's really like a choose your own adventure type transaction. What we're talking about is just make sure you think about it in advance, right? If you get down to the day before retirement and you say, I want to sell my building, you're a couple of years too late.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And that's, I think, the key takeaway. You've shared so much valuable information, but I think the key takeaway is you have to kind of know where you're going.
For sure.
And then let's at least get the information. I like to think of like eyes wide open. Right. So you still get to make the decisions. No one's going to say, hey, you have to sell this building at this day. You have to restructure this lease. You have to do whatever. Right. At least get someone's perspective, like an expert's perspective on how am I positioned given that my goal is to retire in 5 years, retire in 10 years. And what do I need to do? I mean, because you've worked so hard and you've put so much of your own financial investment, but also blood, sweat, and tears in a lot of cases into the practice, into these buildings, that kind of thing. And so making sure that you get the most back out of it to enjoy the next phase for you and your family. That's what we all want for you.
I agree. And I will say it's really circumstantial. Like no situation is exactly the same. So to your point, we're not here to sell you on selling your building. We want to educate you on what your options are so that you can make the right decision at the right time. Because I just see too many people that wait too long or don't think about it. And selling a building for you is not going to change my life, but it might change your life, right? It might change how you think about it or the profile of your investments. And so there are experts out there on the wealth management side, on the real estate side, on the legal side that can really help with that. And so we really try to leverage our network of, advisors that help our clients, right? Because we all have that aligned interest.
Right. Yeah, no, I love it. And we've always talked about like, you need the A team. And so, that was exactly how we met, because you end up in these situations where you're like, hey, I need someone who's an expert in X. I need someone who's an expert in Y for this particular physician. And then you reach out to your network and you can always find someone who can do a dynamite job if you know the right people.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Is there anything else as we wrap up? Is there anything I haven't asked you about that you frequently get questions about that you think we should talk about?
I really think we have talked about all the high points. I'm sure you can tell, but I could talk about this all day, but I'll spare your listeners.
That means you love what you do.
Yeah, exactly. It's true. Just to rehash the point, I think it's just intelligent to think about this in advance. Even if you don't plan to sell your building ever, you should learn about it and you should get the right lease in place well in advance. And so again, you can contact your attorney to do it. We can help you structure a lease with your attorney. And you should also make sure to get your rent set in the range of fair market value, again, dependent on your objectives.
Such key takeaways. So, to that end, talking about connecting with you, where can people find you? I know ERE has a lot of great content. So where can people follow you? Great
question. Yeah, I appreciate it. So we've really doubled down on our video content, just like this, where people can see, put a face to the name. So we're big on YouTube. Our YouTube handle is Healthcare Real Estate at Healthcare Real Estate. And then we're pretty active in the conference circuit, whether it's orthopedics or dermatology or ophthalmology, gastro. We tend to work with the surgical specialists. And so you can usually find us at, a conference in your select specialty.
Perfect. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Collin, for being here. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners did too. And I just love being able to bring value to these areas that are little talked about when it comes to physicians and finance, but are so important and really can, in some senses, make a huge difference in the ultimate outcomes for physicians with their finances. So thank you for being here. Thank you to all of you who are listening. We so appreciate you. Please do subscribe and make sure that you don't miss another one of our amazing episodes coming up. You'll get those notifications every other Friday. And until next time, take care. Thank you for listening to the Doctor's Eyes Only podcast. We hope today's conversation advanced your journey toward wealth that matters. Make sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss a single one of our amazing episodes. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Vestia Advisors, LLC. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. It should not be construed as legal or tax advice and is not intended to replace the advice of a qualified attorney or tax advisor. This information is not an offer or a solicitation to buy or sell securities. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Before investing, you should consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses associated with investment products. Investment decisions should be based on an individual's own goals, time horizon, and tolerance for risk. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Diversification and asset allocation do not ensure a profit or guarantee against loss. Consult your financial professional before making any investments. Investment advisory services offered through Vestia Personal Wealth Advisors, Vestia Retirement Plan Consultants, and Vestia Advisors, LLC. Securities offered through Osdale Financial Partners, Inc., 5187 Utica Ridge Road, Davenport, Iowa, 52807. Member, FINRA, SIPC. Vestia Personal Wealth Advisors, Vestia Retirement Plan Consultants, Vestia Advisors, LLC, and Osdale Financial Partners, Inc. are independently owned and operated.